So what I want to share this afternoon is a way of making sense of human experience and behaviour, and also how we respond to change. Consciousness is a very big word, and there are many, many different interpretations. So I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to focus on how change unfolds for us, both at a personal level and globally, how society is changing at the moment, and also who are we becoming, the future human? So who might we be in 5 years, 10 years' time? And much of what I'm going to talk about today is based on the research of an American professor of psychology called Clare W Graves, who died in 1986 after doing extensive research, including 9 years of field study on over 1,000 people, and then analysing all of that data for the best part of 20 years. But then he died in 1986 before he actually published academically, so his work is hardly known at all, unfortunately. But in his data set, he found some pathfinders, so some people who were actually ahead of the mainstream paradigm, whose consciousness had advanced up to 3 stages or layers ahead of where the mainstream was at the time that he did his research. So I encourage you, while I'm talking, just to notice how you feel. As I talk about these layers of consciousness, imagine that they are like frequencies, like operating frequencies, and notice how you feel, what's going on in your body and in your mind as I give the details of the different ones, and which ones that you might resonate with, and which ones that maybe you don't resonate with. Thank you. All right. So what's going on in the world at the moment? You might have noticed that it's a bit weird. Things seem to be going backwards. And the organisations that once were the most trustworthy in society now seem to be full of criminals. And our governments aren't working so well. Our economic system seems to be in the process of failing. And the people who are representing us, you know, maybe not the people that we might want representing us. So by having a look at how change works, how change unfolds, we can start to make sense of why this is actually going on. So we're going to start by looking at something called a phase shift. So this is a simple map of transformational change that came out of Clare Graves' work. And in the diagram there, the green wavy line represents the complexity of our environment. So, in other words, the degree of difficulty of the kind of problems that we have to solve in everyday life. And you'll notice that it's undulating because that's kind of like the natural rhythm of the universe. We get this sine wave, yin-yang type variation. And when we are able to cope with what life is throwing at us, in other words, we're feeling stable, we're sitting on top of the line like that, and life is generally pretty good, you know. And when life is like that, the human response is we don't really want to change anything. You know, if things are working, then let's not mess with it. Let's not break it. So we try and hang on to that stability. But you'll notice that green wavy line is actually sort of slanting up towards the right-hand side of the screen there. And that represents the fact that we seem to be living in a universe that is constantly becoming more complex. So things are always becoming slowly more complex. And in order to keep up, then we have to become more complex as well. Our consciousness has to operate in more complex ways. So just by trying to hang on to stability, we end up getting stressed because we fall below that line, just by staying on that same level where we were. And we notice that when we wake up one morning and we say, you know, things just don't seem quite right this morning. I'm not too sure what's wrong. I can't really put my finger on it, but I don't know. I just don't feel as good as I did yesterday. And so they're the very earliest signs of stress. And the normal human response to stress is to think back to a time when things were actually working well. So what that means is we go on this regressive search of looking back through our memories and thinking of a time when life was really good and things were working okay. And we think, and maybe not consciously, but maybe subconsciously, we'll start to live life the way that we used to be to see if that makes things better again. But what that actually does, though, is it takes us down here on a journey into chaos. So if that's where we are when we're stable, and here we are stressed, and we think about a time back down the line down here, when this is actually the level we were operating on, and we go back to that, it leads us downhill into chaos. And I used to wonder for many, many years why evolution design changed this way. And it took me quite a few years to figure it out. But I eventually learnt that the distance below that green line is kind of like the elastic band on a slingshot. And if you want to propel yourself in a direction, then what you've got to do with a slingshot is you've got to pull the elastic band back and put tension on it. And so by falling down into this chaotic place, we're actually creating the tension that we need in order to change ourselves. And in that place of chaos is, it's like being in the alchemist's furnace. So it's where the tension builds up in us, and it actually produces changes in our body chemistry, and some of the other speakers have been talking about this today. And it can cause us to rewire our neurons and those sorts of things. So it's a place of transformational change. It's generally not particularly enjoyable, but it's essential for us to make a large change. And also when we're in that place, it helps if we can kind of see where we need to go. But usually when we're in chaos, we have no visibility. It's like being in a fog. And we can't actually see where we need to move to in order to progress our own change process. And we feel trapped, which is why I've got that little smiley face, or not so smiley face, in a red circle there. It's kind of like being trapped. So one of the things that can really help us when we're going through transformational change is anything that brings insights, anything that can change perspectives for us. And as some of you know out there in the audience, psychedelics can be amazing for that. So by taking psychedelics in a responsible and sensible way, and ideally with somebody who knows how to do psychedelic therapy, we can actually, from that place of chaos, start to get glimpses of where we can go and how we might be in the future. So we get insights and we can have peak experiences. And a peak experience on psychedelics, or really any altered state technology, can allow us to go from this chaotic place here and stick a periscope up here for a moment and then come back down again. So we can momentarily be like we would be if we were up on top of the line here somewhere, okay? And over time, those repeated experiences can actually help us break out of this chaotic place. And when that happens, it's kind of like we see the light, you know, it's an evangelical energy. It's like, oh my God, I just had an insight, now I know what I need to do. At last I can move, I can change. And so when we come out the other side of that chaotic place, we generally have very high levels of energy. And we just can't wait to do something to make life better, to get to that place that we saw during our insight. And sometimes that energy can be a bit like an unguided missile too, and we'll come out of there and we just know that we've got to do something, but we're not quite exactly sure which direction we need to go. And I'm sure you've all seen friends, those of you who dabble in the psychedelic world, friends who've had some amazing, enlightening experience on psychedelics, and all of a sudden, you know, they come out and they just want to be evangelical and drag everybody else in for the experience. So over time, once we break out and we're in that renewal phase, over time and with proper integration, then we can rise back up again to a new place of stability. And we're back on top of the line and we can cope with life's problems, so life is good once again. And you'll notice that that kind of looks like the setting and rising sun, that pattern, with the sun going down into the place of darkness and then rising back up and into the sky again. And this is why many, many civilizations throughout history have used this very, very basic format of change and seen the sun as like a symbol of that. You know, the sun dies every night and it goes into the darkness and it gets transformed and then it comes up and rises again in the morning. So there's that very same pattern right there that we all go through when we go through change. And of course, all of the transformational things that everyone's been talking about today are basically about this same pattern. And when we go down through the chaos, the formal name for that is revolutionary change, because it involves being restricted and then breaking out like a revolution in society. And if we are conscious enough of the change process and we understand how to detect these very, very early signs of change, then we can take a shortcut up here sometimes, which is called evolutionary change, where we wake up in the morning and we don't feel right, and if we understand this, we can say, aha, something needs to change, and then maybe go on a search for whatever that might be. And if we're really, really skilled at managing change, then we can take that evolutionary path. And I think as we become more evolved, more conscious and more aware with better senses, it will be easier for humanity to take that evolutionary path in the future. Now this pattern applies not just to us at a personal level, but it also applies to large scale as well. And what we're seeing in the wider world at the moment is that we're actually in transition. The whole world is in transition, and our consciousness is changing. And we're actually descending towards the chaos at the moment, and we can feel the tension building on the elastic band, okay? We can see our systems slowly failing to work as they used to, and we can see our leaders starting to deconstruct some of our institutions and empires. So the same pattern applies at all scales, really. So you'll notice that the stabilities are on different levels, right? One's kind of higher than the other, and that in that diagram there, the distance up the screen implies greater complexity, okay, and greater coping capacity. So when we go through a transformational change, we don't come out the other end the same, we come out different. And in the field of psychology, those differences that we find as we go through steps of change are classified as developmental stages or steps or layers. And one of the most simple models of human development in a layered or staged sense is this three-stage one. And the first red shape there, the pre-rational zone, refers to living according to our instincts and urges. So no real involvement of the rational mind, but just doing whatever we feel like we need to do, whether it's eating now, making love now, searching for food now, whatever it might be. And that very, very basic stage we see in babies and young children. And early in the evolution of our species, we saw it in hunter-gatherer type lifestyles and early tribal lifestyles and those sorts of things. So it's very much in the moment. It's very much just noticing what I need right now, or what we need right now, and attending to it straight away. And it's also very strongly driven by emotions as well. So if a person is feeling angry, they'll just express that anger. They don't think about whether they should express it or not. It just comes out. So it's a very much an in-the-moment way of living. And then the second orange shape there, the rational zone, is where the rational mind kicks in. So in an evolutionary sense, this was where we developed our frontal lobes, which were able to moderate our lower instincts and urges. And personally, sort of late teenage years is when our frontal lobes finish developing. So you can see in teenage behavior lots of this pre-rational kind of living, where anything that they want to do it now, and they don't want to moderate their urges, they just want to satisfy them straight away. We move into the rational zone, and the rational mind then allows us to logic things out, and we can start to see the cause and effect in things. We can start to think about, okay, I really want to do this now, I feel like I need to do it, but I know if I do it, then there'll be bad consequences later, okay? So our behavior can become moderated, we can start to plan ahead, and we can start to live in more complex ways. And then eventually, I might say that current society and the global paradigm that dominates the world at the moment is well and truly in this rational zone, okay? So moving into the trans-rational zone there is really moving into the future, or looking at people who are pathfinding consciousness. And in the research that I'm basing this on, there were a few pathfinders that were found back in the 1950s and 60s who were displaying this kind of trans-rational consciousness. So trans-rational is not rational, for starters. So you've got three zones there, two of them aren't rational, okay? It's important to remember that. And in the transition beyond rational, we have to then learn how to behave in a non-rational way again. And that can be tricky, and often people get confused when they're transitioning from rational to trans-rational, and confused pre-rational for trans-rational. So they might think that they're getting deep insights, but they're actually acting out of fears from the pre-rational zone. And we have to learn to discern the difference between those two things to then bed down that trans-rational way of being. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just divide each of these three zones up into three layers, just to make this a little bit more detailed. And we can start to look at the history of humanity, where we are now and where we're headed in the future. So you can see there, each of those three zones now has three layers within it. And those layers begin down the bottom with number one, an automatic way of living, which equates to our hunter-gatherer existence as a species, or to when we were a young baby as an individual. When we're born, we don't think about what to do, we just eat, we sleep, and we kind of learn about our environment. And then the second stage is a tribal stage, and traditionally at a species level that meant a subsistence lifestyle where the hunter-gatherers came together to live in a larger group for safety and also so they could start to give birth to culture. So when that tribal layer emerged was at the same time that we saw the explosion of culture about 50,000 years ago. And then a progression beyond tribal to an egocentric or martial way of being. And that involved people in the tribe starting to think that they didn't need to follow the customs of the tribe anymore, that maybe the tribal chief wasn't the smartest guy around, and that they knew better, and they would go beyond the tribal boundary and maybe find some other land, and maybe take someone else's land by force and those sorts of things. So we went through this martial phase, egocentricity, and then eventually when the rational mind started to develop, the frontal lobes I mean, we discovered large-scale agriculture, and we could start to plant large fields of crops which would feed many, many people. We didn't need to just use subsistence gardens anymore or go and steal someone else's food. We could have large-scale agriculture, come together in towns and cities and build large societies. And we needed to think in a disciplined way to do that. So we needed a rational mind to actually cope with that, work out rules for society, rules for living. And in this fourth layer was also the time in history that gave birth to our major religions, which basically gave us a list of rules to follow, to live life the right way. It was a very linear way of thinking, that first rational layer, number 4, the authoritarian. And then eventually over time, only about 300 years ago really, is when it came into the mainstream, was the fifth layer, which is the modern lifestyle. So a multiplistic way of thinking, whereas the fourth layer is a very linear way of thinking. There's only one right way to live life according to the rules. And we broke out of that into a multiplistic way of thinking where we look for options and we would find the best option instead of just following a rigid set of rules, which gave rise to the scientific and industrial revolutions and the society that we're now all living in. So each one of these layers you can see as like a computer's operating system, or perhaps a frequency, an operating frequency. And each one has its own unique way of thinking. Each one has a particular worldview. So, for example, number 3, egocentric martial, sees the world as like a jungle where you've got to fight to survive all the time. So you always have to be on guard, you always have to be prepared to use your power in order to live properly. The tribal worldview is very, very much connected to nature and animistic in its spirituality, so it sees that everything has a spirit and there's a spirit in everything, and each one of those spirits also has its own character and we can interact with them. And also each different layer brings its own values and motivations. And these differences here, coming back to the present day, are what we've called generation gaps. You know, I can't talk to my kids because they don't have the same ideas about life as me. And it all really comes back to these layers of consciousness developing and us growing through them as we grow from a young child into an adult. And how far we grow up the scale of complexity is related to the complexity of our life conditions. So if life is simple and it remains simple, then we only need to live the tribal way in order to be happy. And there are still people living the tribal way now in countries like Papua New Guinea or parts of Africa who are still living in a subsistence tribal manner. And there are still people who are living the martial way in countries like Somalia or perhaps in the Middle East in places where life is all about expressing your power and making sure that no one has power over you, and perhaps killing people if you need to. The hunter-gatherer level, it's debatable whether there are still any hunter-gatherers left on the planet, but certainly if we look at many cities around the world, we'll find people who are perhaps mentally ill and they're living virtually a survival hunter-gatherer existence on the streets. So it's certainly still around. And of course, lots and lots of people are still living the agricultural way, where they're abiding by a strict set of rules, which may be religious rules, or there may be some other kind of cultural rules, and they're very dependent upon an agricultural kind of an existence. So, as I said, these apply both at a personal growth level and a species level. And as we move, you'll notice that I've staggered these from side to side as they go up. So the even numbers are on the left and the odd numbers are on the right. And that's related to the influence of our brain. So I'm just going to quickly show you what that's about. Here's your brain, and here's your brain on drugs. That's just a joke, it's all right. So imagine that's a pendulum there, and there's a pattern of left brain, right brain dominance as we move through these different layers of consciousness, as we grow through them. So over here we've got the left brain, and you'll notice that's on your right-hand side, okay? On the right-hand side of the screen, because your left brain talks to the right-hand side of the body and vice versa. So when there's a left brain dominance, there's an individual theme, and living life is all about self-expression. And we want to change the world to fit with us, with me, right, or with you. You want the world to be the way you want it to be, and if needs be, you'll change it to be that way so you're happy. And that's a kind of a male theme. And then when there's a right brain dominance, we have communal themes playing out. So it's about self-sacrifice. When we live in community, we have to make compensation for everyone else's wants and needs as well. So we have to adjust, we have to adapt, we have to conform. And that's all about changing ourselves internally to fit with what the world needs from us. Okay, and that's a feminine sacrifice theme. So that's constantly happening as we grow through these stages. And you've seen this idea of different ways of approaching the world come out in some of the previous talks today as well. So if we go back to these, you'll see that the odd numbers are individually themed, left brain, and the even numbers are communally themed. And there are patterns within there, other patterns as well. And we can look at each side and we can see that, okay, the hunter-gatherer was a really basic way of living, but it was using violence, to kill animals and survive, and then a more sophisticated, complex version of that resulted in us actually taking over other people's lands and perhaps even killing them in order to survive and be happy in life. And then further to the scientific industrial was very much about changing the world to suit what we need and using the world as a resource and using war as a business. Okay, so you can see how the same ideas have just got more complex and more complex as we go up the layers. And on this side you've got the first communal right brain theme was tribal with a subsistence lifestyle, and then the authoritarian agricultural way of living is just a kind of a bigger version of that, where we're living in much larger groups and we've got much larger areas where we gather our crops from, maybe right around the world, but it's still similar in theme that it's communal, a communal way of living. So right now, there is a change going on, as I said before. So we're shifting, the whole world is shifting, we are shifting, and we're moving to the next communal stage. And the whole global paradigm is in transition. And we can see that the old scientific industrial way of living is starting to fail. The ways that we have run nation states, in fact, the whole idea of a nation state came from stage or layer 5. Okay, it's a modern idea. It hasn't been around all the time. Prior to that, we had empires in the authoritarian world with kings and queens. And so many of the things that were invented, created during this 5th layer of consciousness being dominant around the planet are starting to fail. Our economic system, our political system. And parallel to that, so we have the failure of the systems here, but parallel to that, we've got this 6th layer rising. So there are more and more people in the world, including you guys, who are trying to live life differently and have different values and different motivations. And actually, in many cases, strongly reject the old style. It's very, very usual when we go through a transition like this for people to start hating the old way of living, okay, and they even want to destroy it sometimes. So this is why the world seems a bit strange. We're trying to run a world that's got way more complex than these old systems can cope with. They don't work anymore. And we're still trying to make them work. We're saying, okay, we've got to get this working somehow. How can we elect a different president, or how can we fix the stock exchange, the monetary system somehow? And yet we're trying to fix systems that will never, ever do the job that they need to do in today's more complex world. So let's have a quick look at this 6th layer and see what it's about. In history, it first emerged, at least in the 1800s, if not earlier, when we started to see these social justice movements appearing for the women's vote and those sorts of things. And also, we had a big flare-up then in the 1960s and early 70s with the flower revolution, the summer of love, and all that kind of stuff. And this is how change happens with these layers of consciousness. It comes in waves. So you'll get a wave rising up, and if there's not enough for it to hang on to, it'll fall back down again. And that's what happened in the 60s, was there was quite a strong wave globally of this 6th layer thinking, this relativistic thinking. And people were very, very happy about it. They, made festivals and marched in the street asking for change and this kind of stuff, but they didn't have enough to hang on to. There wasn't enough scaffolding to hold it up. And so it was squashed back down again by the old 5th layer. It did, however, keep growing in the background, and many people are saying that this time that we're living in now is like the new 60s. It showed up in research in all sorts of different places, actually. This is some marketing research from Nielsen, the big marketing company. And their reports in 2012 and 2013 were talking about this globally, socially conscious consumer, which they thought was just another market segment that they could sell stuff to, right? But actually, what they didn't know is that they were picking up an evolutionary shift in human consciousness and putting it in their marketing reports. But many people didn't recognize that at the time. But they were saying that here are some folks out there who are reasonably young. They're very green. They'll actually spend more money to be green, and they'll pay more money for socially responsible services that are good for the environment and the wider world. So right now, we're actually approaching a series of tipping points, which is going to push the old 5th layer backwards and bring number 6 up as the dominant global paradigm. And to give you some idea of how social values are changing in that process, here is a comparison between the old multiplistic values from the 5th layer of consciousness on the left side, and then how they are changing to the 6th relativistic layer of consciousness on the right. Some very interesting changes there. So where in the old world, people were driven by personal ambition, they wanted to be successful, it was all about me being successful. But now, in the new world, we'll be driven by human connection. We really want deep human connection, so we need each other. We can't do that on our own. It's not something that I can achieve on my own. I have to have someone else to connect with. Knowledge is changing. Knowledge isn't what it used to be, and we know that from fake news, and no one actually knows what the truth is. We prefer cooperation over competition. We really value peer acceptance, and I'm sure that you can read the rest of them there yourself. And for the old paradigm, success brought credibility in the world, and that was like the ultimate reward. But now inner peace brings harmony for us, and that's what we're seeking. And you can see how in the old multiplistic way, it was all about engaging with the world and changing it so I can be successful. And now we have to look inside and look for our own inner peace in order to find harmony. So here are some themes that are showing up from the emergence of this new 6th layer. There's a very strong decentralization theme, and we just heard from Theo about the technology side of that. So where we had centralized power in the 5th layer, we're now decentralizing that. It's being spread out, so it's going from like an individuated power to a communal power. We are gaining the capacity as individuals to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. So the perspective we had in the 5th layer was very much from a single point of perspective, looking out at the world. But from this relativistic perspective, we can move around and we can say, well, you know, I know what it's like to be in their shoes in this country and what they're going through, and that I can feel it, it must be terrible. And so our whole perspective of reality is changing, our framework for reality is changing, and this happens every time we go through these layers to a different layer. Every time a transition happens, our whole framework for reality changes. Social justice is very important. I've got Einstein up there at the top left because Einstein, he came up with a theory of relativity. And he thought about what it would be like if someone was traveling on a spaceship off the planet and their brother was staying here on Earth, and how they would experience time differently. So he was thinking in a relativistic way, you know, well ahead of the mainstream when he came up with that theory. And Einstein went on to operate from higher layers later in his life also. And organisations like Greenpeace that are very much ecologically focused and trying to make the world a better place by looking after our natural resources. And the other big theme which is coming out with the emergence of this 6th layer is personal healing. And I'm sure you've all probably had some experience of different modalities of personal healing as you've changed into this layer yourself. And psychedelics, of course, is another way of experiencing that. So the blockchain revolution, or should I say the distributed ledger technology revolution, Theo, is very, very significant because when our worldviews change and our frameworks for reality change, our ways of designing social systems change as well. And those social systems that we develop then support our new way of living. And this is an example of an evolutionary shift in the way that we design social systems. Because it's distributed, it's not centralized, because it's encrypted so it can't be corrupted, and pretty much all of the systems that were invented by the 5th layer of consciousness have been corrupted. And I'm quite sure that this blockchain revolution, and even though it's in its early days and the technology will continue to develop, I think it's going to power the social revolution as well. So in terms of the 6th layer superseding the 5th layer as the dominant global paradigm, I think this is where the money is going to come from. And the old paradigm is very much tied to economics. It's powered by money, and the only way that that's going to change is to get a better economic system that can actually supersede the old one. So, just excuse me, I just want to check something there. Okay, so as we look back at the evolution of humanity, the time that it's taken us to move through these different layers has gradually got shorter and shorter and shorter. So hunter-gatherers, we were in that layer probably for a couple of 100,000 years. Tribal started at least 50,000 years ago, if not earlier. The egocentric martial era, I really don't have any accurate figures on when that might have started. But I know that the agricultural era started somewhere between probably 12,000 and 10,000 years ago when we started to use large-scale cropping. And then the scientific industrial era only really started to gather momentum about 300 years ago. So you can see how those timescales are slowly getting shorter and shorter. And if that pattern continues, then this relativistic decentralized era will probably only be about 2 decades long, roughly. Okay, so we're in a transition time at the moment, and this transition is going to take some more time, maybe 10, 15 years, before this sixth layer becomes the dominant global system. And then it may only be the dominant global system for a decade or two. And then we'll be moving into the transrational layers. So let's move into the future now. I guess I've given you a little taste of what life will be like when the relativistic sixth layer is the dominant global system, because we'll have systems like blockchain, and we'll all be focused on personal healing, and we'll be building community and behaving in very different ways. And it's probably important to say too that not everybody in the world is changing at the same time. So you'll remember before that I said there are still people living the tribal way, there are still people living the martial way and the agricultural way and the scientific industrial way, okay? We are actually the exception at the moment, the people in this room, because we're the pathfinders for this new way of living. And even when this relativistic decentralized layer becomes the dominant global system, there will still be people living these other ways, simply because they live in less complex life conditions. They live in simple ways. They don't need to live in complex ways. And so their consciousness just balances itself with the surrounding life conditions. And that's a normal human trait. So the shift to the trans-rational layer is going to take some tension. And one of the things that is going to cause that tension is the fact that we now have really 6 different worlds coexisting on the planet. Okay, so you can really think of each one of these layers as a different world. It literally has a different framework for making sense of reality. And up till now, you know, we've been coexisting, kind of. Every now and again, you know, we have a global war that breaks out and we kill each other. But I guess we've managed to stay alive and survive, haven't we, this far? But we're about to add a 6th layer, which is going to increase the complexity. So when we bump into people from these other layers, if we are living according to, say, any one of those on the screen there at the moment, we'll think that our way of living is right, our values are right, we know how to be happy in life, and this other person who seems to be living differently doesn't have the same values as me, doesn't live like me, must be wrong, yeah? Obviously wrong. So maybe we need to change them. So maybe we can send missionaries to their country and teach them how to be like us. Or maybe we can invade their country and kill their army and then bring them free market economies like we have. Then they'll be happy like us. And this is the way it has been in human history. So these differences in frameworks for reality, difference in worldview, are really at the root of all human consciousness, all human conflict, okay? Because we see things that aren't like us, we see, you know, values that aren't like ours, and we feel like we must change them. There's a compulsion to make everybody like us. And so the tension of having more and more differences on the planet is building and building and building. And being in one of these layers and being dominated, you know, having your framework of reality designed according to one of these 6 layers is kind of like being a fish in a fishbowl, okay? You have a perspective and you can see everything, but you can't really see the bowl. You can't really see the water, okay? If you ask the fish about the water, it says, what water? Because it has a fixed perspective and it only has one view of the world, which is the view from its bowl. So what we're about to do as a species when we get beyond this 6th layer, and I've got to say, just remind you that during the research that was done back in the 1950s and 60s, there were people found who were already living in these transrational ways. What's about to happen on a large scale, maybe within the next 40 to 50 years, is the fish is about to jump out of the fishbowl, okay? And the fish is you. And some of you in this audience have probably already jumped out of the fishbowl. And you're going to look back at the fishbowl and go, oh my God, I was in a fishbowl. And at a planetary level, what that means is that we are going to look back and start to see these layers of consciousness, okay? So one of the things that happens when we jump out of the fishbowl is we attain the capacity to see and directly sense layers of consciousness. So when we meet someone else, we can feel their frequency, their operating frequency is different than ours. And we can actually read their frequency and sense which layer that their consciousness is operating from, okay? And at a personal level, when we go through the transition, just thinking back to the change slide where we go through the chaos, this change to transrational, jumping out of the fishbowl, is probably the most difficult change that humanity has ever gone through. Because it's such a large leap in consciousness, we have to pull that elastic band back a long way, okay? So there has to be a lot of tension. And maybe some of you in the audience who have gone through this transition will know that from personal experience, that you've been through an extremely difficult dark night of the soul, but you've come out the other side with a massively enhanced capacity to cope with life and to sense things. So the kind of tension that's going to drive this change at a global level is building fast, actually. It's really already there. And when we get to the point of making this big leap, we'll probably feel like our world is about to collapse. At a global level, there'll be multiple compounding problems, both physical problems and psychological problems. And the tension created by the interaction and coexistence of all these the 6 previous layers creates a whole lot of tension. And then nature herself is also creating tension because nature is changing as well. And there's a synchronicity between our change and nature's change. So the climate is changing. The species extinction is building. And nature herself is going to come out the other side of a transition in a better place also. So I think Theo listed a whole bunch of the tensions, that the Sustainable Development Goals are looking at, and the things that more and more people are starting to take notice of and try and start conversations about us solving. Things like the loss of biodiversity, the pollution of the oceans and the atmosphere, climate change, population mobility, pandemics, destructive technology, social systems collapse, and I'm sure that you know many, many more. So there's a long list. And all of these things are going to eventually bring us as a species to the point where we leap out of the fishbowl, we stand back and look at how we've been living, we see clearly who we have been, and we change to be something very, very different. So to give you a sense of how huge this transition to the 7th layer is, it's actually a quantum leap, which is why my talk is called Quantum Consciousness. I'm going to just change this slide so that it gives you an idea of how much influence each one of these different layers has when we get to the 7th layer. So it looks like this. So what happens is we disentangle ourselves from the previous 6 layers. And because we disentangle from them, they collapse down and we get this massive free psychological space, which gives us extraordinary coping capacity. In fact, there's more coping capacity in layer 7 than in all of the first 6 combined. Just have a think about that for a moment. Think about what we've been able to achieve as a species in just the 5th layer. We went to the moon, right? And here we are moving to a layer that has more capacity than all 6 of the previous ones. So it's huge. All of those 6 previous layers are still accessible to us. We can still dynamically move up and down. So if we meet somebody who's operating from the 4th layer, we can meet them there. We can be from the 4th layer. We can share their values and speak to them. And so we have this amazing kind of shape-shifting capacity that develops, which allows us to be with all sorts of different people and be comfortable with that and understand where they're coming from, because we can read their frequency and we can match it. And what that means is that we no longer have fear of others, right? We don't fear people because they're different. We don't fear them because they come from a different country or they look different. We can be with them very comfortably. So layer 7 is an individually themed layer, okay? But it's called integrative because it starts to integrate left and right brain. So the differences between individual and communal get much, much smaller. and the brain is operating in a more integrated way, which is part of the reason why we have this massive coping capacity. So you'll see that I've put that just off to the left brain side there a little bit, enough. It's still individual, it still wants to change the world, but it's not an extreme anymore. It's not an extreme compulsion. There are no compulsions. So the guy who did this research, Clare W Graves, he called this a momentous leap in consciousness, and here's what he had to say about it. Called it the most difficult, but at the same time the most exciting transition the human race has faced. And not merely a transition to a new level of existence, but the start of a new movement in the symphony of human history. And some people who are operating in this social change space, talking about shifting consciousness, are wondering whether this is actually the emergence of a new species. And I don't have an answer to that, but it's an interesting question. So here are some of the attributes that come with this seventh layer. I'll let you read through those. And with this extra awareness, you know, the first thing that humans do is they look around at the world and they say, oh my God, we've got some work to do, okay? And thankfully, this extraordinary coping capacity means that we'll probably be able to solve those problems with this level of consciousness. I'll put these slides up on the web later for you if you like. Here are some of the themes. Now, there aren't too many concrete examples of this layer of consciousness in the world because there aren't too many people who are there yet. But one of the organisations that is there is the Ethereum project, and particularly Vitalik Buterin, and probably Joe Lubin as well, who's who's one of the founders of Ethereum and is heading up Consensus. So these guys have an extraordinary coping capacity, and that's part of the reason why the Ethereum platform has been doing so well. Some people that have been writing about these ideas, Ken Wilber in his Integral Psychology book, anyone who's working with complex adaptive systems usually is coming from this space or close to it. Max Planck, of course, who was the father of quantum mechanics. And on the right-hand side of the bottom there, I've got a couple of books about Clare Graves, who is the guy who did the research I'm talking about here. So at a personal level, our energetic makeup, so back to the individual experience, our energetic makeup is changing. So you're probably familiar with the chakra system, which comes from the ancient Vedic writings and Indian philosophy, where we have these energy centers in the body. And of course, Chinese medicine talks about energy meridians in the body and acupuncture points, which can be used for healing. This is the old energetic makeup of humanity. And this changes when we go to the seventh layer. And there's no separation between our energetic makeup and our consciousness. It's part of the same system, okay? So to be conscious at the seventh layer, you have to have a different energetic makeup. And there are very few people who have any detail around this new energetic makeup yet, but one who I have found is this guy, Dr. Mikio Sankey, who is a Japanese-American acupuncturist. He has a PhD in traditional Chinese medicine, and he has started to write books about what is basically the light body geometry. So you've probably heard of the light body concept from New Age discussions. Lots of talk about it, but very few people really know much about it or can talk in material ways about it. This guy is the only guy I've found so far who actually understands how we are developing all this complex geometry in the body. So all of the lines there are lines between acupuncture points, just not all points, but just certain points. And they represent geometries, energetic geometries, which are appearing in the body, which are three-dimensional and can spin, okay? And this change in our energetic makeup is closely connected to, it's part of this big shift in consciousness. So the other big shift that comes with this quantum leap is in the first 6 layers, every layer was thinking, how do I survive, okay? But once we get into the transrational zone, that changes to who am I being? So we're moving away from a survival mindset to a way of being mindset. And in Clare Graves' research, he found 8 different layers, and this is back in the 1950s. Out of 1,065 people that he studied, there were only 6 of them who showed up at this 8th layer, 6 out of 1,065, so a very small percentage. But they're out there, okay? And maybe there are some in this room. And this takes us back to the communal side again. So from the individual integrative to the communal holistic. And there really isn't much information about this. I've got some of Clare Graves' notes, which I'll show you shortly. But we don't know an awful lot about it, except that it seems to be a super organic way of living. So if you think about a beehive or a big ant's nest, how they look inside these nests and there doesn't seem to be anybody in charge, but they're all organized and everybody knows what to do. Everybody has a role and they just know instinctively what their role is. It's in their DNA and they just go with the large-scale organic organization. And so it's looking like humanity is also changing to this super organic way. And this is way off in the future. I can't put a time scale on this when this might be the dominant global system, but it's emerging. And with these transrational systems, the important thing is because they are so capable and so aware and so conscious, they can have massive influence on the world. So we only need a small percentage of people who attain these high levels of consciousness to actually change the world in very significant ways. So some people have been writing about this 8th layer, this super organic way of being. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the French philosopher, Jesuit priest, wrote about the noosphere, which he said was like the atmosphere and the ionosphere, except it was a layer of mind around the planet. Morphic resonance fits with this mindset. Rupert Sheldrake's work. Princeton University are working on this global consciousness project where they're looking at sensing energetic changes around the planet and talk of the global mind. A few different authors are writing about the global mind. Here's a quick look. I hope you can read all that. Let me read it for you just in case you can't. So it taps into the global mind like a hive mind, intuitive sensing, quantum consciousness. So in the experiments where they split a photon and the 2 particles go off and then they're remotely located, one spins and the other one knows that the other one's spinning in which direction. This is direct knowing, it's direct intuition, okay? And this is what emerges with the transrational zone, is this direct intuition, we just know. Lives minimally, less is more, seeks to stabilize global society, practice experiential spirituality, and again, psychedelics are a wonderful tool for the emergence of this consciousness. And I'll let you read the left there. My time is up. I have to wrap up. So it looks like this is an open system. Clare Graves said there's no end to this. As long as the world keeps becoming more complex, our consciousness will keep adapting in more complex ways. So there's probably a 9th system, probably already existing because the research stopped back in the 1960s. But we don't have a map for it yet. And I just want to finish up with a slide from a project that I'm working on at the moment, a project called Aadii, which is a non-profit agency that's being created to support advanced human development, particularly the development of these transrational layers of consciousness through healing centers around the world that will use the very latest consciousness-raising technologies, and also a global network, which will actually be a network of networks. So technology that allows your organizations, any organization that is working to advance consciousness, to come on to the platform as a network and be next to all of the other networks from around the world who are doing the same kind of work, perhaps in different industries or different disciplines, so we can start to see each other and collaborate and work more closely together. Thank you very much.